Thank you for joining me and thank you for being here. So, I have always loved high fantasy. I grew up on Lord of the Rings, The Legend of Drizzt, and I'm really just starting to delve more into D&D. The dwarves have always been my favorite fantasy species. Rough, loyal, master craftsmen that are just as often depicted as being the sweet old uncle. So when I saw a chunky book titled The Dwarves, with my favorite bearded warrior on the cover, I couldn't not pick it up, right? And since this month we're talking about books, I thought let's talk about what has become my personal favorite high fantasy series in The Dwarves by Markus Heitz. Starting with Die Zwerg, The Dwarves. When I first opened this book, it was honestly really overwhelming. Really early on, you are hit with a barrage of high fantasy proper nouns with more consonants and syllables than I know what to do with. Names like Girglegard and Gandagar, Nadine and Nadan. Those are both titles for the same person, if that makes it easier. Then there's Bowindil and Bowindal. Those are different characters. I had a genuinely hard time following the story on my first attempt. It wasn't until I picked up the audiobook performed by Matthew Wolfe that I felt I could really appreciate the story, especially on the first consumption. Wolfe's narration is very, very clear, and that is very important in a story with as many fantastical words as The Dwarves has. This book is the first of 5 ongoing series, at least 5 translated into English, following Tungdil Goldhand, an orphan dwarf that was raised by a human wizard in a world where races are extremely segregated. In this world, there are 5 dwarven kingdoms that rotate the responsibility of High King, so when said king is getting ready to kick the bucket, and we see the successor is a bit of a twat waffle, we call upon the orphan dwarf of unknown origin to make a play for the throne. At the same time, a corrupted wizard is making a play for power by allying himself with the Perished Land, this pretty nebulous evil that is constantly encroaching on Girglegard. And if someone dies in the Perished Land, they'd rise as an undead revenant. A lot of the narrative is the politics of the dwarves and understanding the overall landscape of the world. The dwarves see themselves as the god-appointed guardians of the realm from the stereotypically evil races of orcs and the elves. And the elves being pretty much especially evil elves, who also exist separately and have a significantly different part to play in this narrative. So, don't think we don't have elves here. There are also a band of dwarves who are set aside as being evil in their own right or rejecting the god that created the dwarves, Vracus. Oh yeah, and the universe of the dwarves also has its own deity system that I still don't fully understand. It's used as a reason to hate some races, but also come into play in a bigger aspect a few books down the line in an interesting way. There are also the human kingdoms of Girglegard that ultimately act as an example of how much the world actually needs the dwarves because the humans done fuck up a lot. This world building helps inform a lot of the characters, but absolutely do not define them. The world building and character work are what I would say are the strongest elements in Heitz's writing. Narratively, this is very much a hero's journey that Joseph Campbell would be so proud of, with a handful of subversions tossed in to raise the stakes and intensity. Tungdil builds a band of friends and allies of different races and talents, including a wizard and her monster bodyguard, as well as the series MVP Rodario, a traveling human playwright and actor who forces his band of actors to follow the adventure to write the best play he can write himself into, and ultimately having several major roles throughout the entire series. The Dark Wizard is definitely the main antagonist of the story, but the elves are especially high-danger secondary antagonists. Honestly, scarier as a whole. The Dark Wizard is very stereotypical, power-hoarding guy, while the elves are so sadistically evil it exceeds most stereotypes. Think of an entire nation full of Cenobite-level sadomasochistic elves with pitch-black eyes and pearl-white skin. The elves would make the Boltons on the Game of Thrones blush. Their hobbies include painting with the blood of their still-living victims on canvases of their flayed skin, and extreme body modification, killing yourself just to revive as a revenant to prove you are extra evil. These are what they do for fun. Heights also works in heavy metaphor throughout the narrative. While the wizards are more D&D than Lord of the Rings, magic system in the world is treated as a very finite resource like oil. Wizards can study and perform a spell or make a potion that can do almost anything, but have to literally recharge their magical battery. I love the symbolism here, but not necessarily the execution. I never did. but I don't have a good reason for not liking the magic system other than me being a bit of a stick in the mud. As a whole, this book also could stand to be a little more daring in its narrative. While Tungdil isn't necessarily the prophesized hero of Dwarven legend, his narrative is very straightforward. There is also a very weird juxtaposition between very basic names like Blacksaddle and crazy fantasy names like Belindis. But that could also be a problem with the translation, as titles like Backsaddle certainly have clearer one-to-one translations. These feel like extremely minor complaints for me in context to both everything the story does so well and the larger narrative as a whole that I have read through its entirety in the past. It does address just about every gripe I have with Markus Heitz's writing outside of the magic system. Book one final thoughts, yeah, I get this one being a little harder to get through. It feels like a Kickstarter novel with really good ideas, and that's kind of what it was. Der Krieg des Weg, the War of the Dwarves. Unlike the first book, the first time I got into this story, I had no trouble getting invested in what was going on in this story. Also, so I wouldn't get burnt out from the story between going through the Dwarves installments, I would listen to The Lord of the Rings as read by Andy Serkis. It made for a really interesting juxtaposing and a great way to compare narrative and world-building styles. Markus Heitz, for comparison, is probably a good between point in both styling and tone, with J.R.R. Tolkien on one end and George R.R. Martin on the other. But again, I cannot express how powerfully sadistic Heitz gets in some moments. It's so German. The War of the Dwarves takes place almost immediately after the first book. And like that first book, we have several antagonists playing with each other begrudgingly. And more importantly for the narrative, against the greater Dwarven race in this universe. In this book, we also spend a lot of time with the antagonists to experience the Orc and the Alfar cultures and leadership structures. We saw a lot of them from the outside in the last novel, and it's great to explore Heitz's version of these fantasy races more here. Last novel, we also heard a lot about the Thirdlings, essentially a kingdom of evil dwarves thanks to a generational feud that traces all the way back to the original 5 dwarven fathers in this world's mythology. It's only the first 2/3 of the book that the Thirdlings, the Orcs, and the Alfar act as the antagonists, with this ominous but vague mythical threat in the background that is used in a lot of interesting aspects throughout the entire novel, showing its face in the final act that is such a highlight I almost wish it was made into its own book instead. Outside of the occasional antagonist perspective, the bulk of the story is through that of the heroes of the last book. There is Tungdil Goldhand, the main protagonist, a Thirdling in his own right, but was abandoned at birth and raised by humans until the start of last book's adventure, who spends most of this story cleaning up all the threats we were left with at the end of last book, because the entire evil army doesn't just die after we killed an evil wizard like every other fantasy series, while simultaneously coming to terms with himself not being considered a quote-unquote normal dwarf culturally. Then there is Namora the Unnerving. She was part of Rodario's traveling stage show, a half-Alfar, half-human badass pregnant actress who spends a lot of this story learning magic to be more badass from the last living wizard in this realm, and Akai the Tempestuous from the last book as well. Her plot is thematically about her uncovering the machinations of the underhanded for the greater good schemes of the city after her husband Fergus the engineer is targeted. And Rodario, the human himbo that is just trying to keep the world held together long enough that he can open a theater and put on his show and become famous. He is so beautifully vain in his motivations, but this drives him again to be a part of the main action, but it's always on the side of either protecting the city and its people so they can love him, or because he genuinely loves his friend Namora and Fergus. In a story full of archetypal characters, Rodario feels like the archetype that is the most flawed and real. Again, Heitz's strength is in his archetypal characters and how they don't necessarily interact with how you'd expect with the almost overly archetypal world Heitz puts his characters in. If you want a beautifully original and well-crafted fantasy worlds with elements you have never seen, you won't find it here. But I equally don't think that's the point of Heitz's story. Not that a huge crux of the story revolving around a doomsday weapon that relies on a blood quantum doesn't make me intrinsically uncomfortable. It feels less thought out than the deep character building the rest of the story gives. Neil Dixon takes over narrating duties in this version of the story, in the version of the story I had access to, and is largely a fantastic reader. Although near the end, I think he may have mixed up a few character voices. And when running lines, that is a very common thing I do in my head, involves either on the original writing, I think, or the translation, as this story was originally in German, like all of these works. Final note on the War of the Dwarves, this is the happiest ending you're going to see in these books, so clutch it to your chest with everything you have for as long as you can. Iras der Zwerg, The Revenge of the Dwarves. The Revenge of the Dwarves is both another improvement in Markus Heitz's storytelling and overall writing ability, continues to take steps forward in his highest of high fantasy series. At the same time, this book also made me especially frustrated with the characters at some moments, especially our protagonist Tungdil. I really enjoy how Heitz expands the world of Girglegard beyond its borders with the introduction of new races and monsters that I feel are pretty unique to his world as he describes them here. Primarily, we have the Umbaryu, which is the name of both a race of basically elevated orcs with a civilization not built on raping and pillaging, and a disdain for orcs as strong as the dwarves, as well as what the not-orcs call their land's dwarves, who most of the characters call undergroundlings here, just to make it easy. So you have the Umbaryu, which are super smart orcs, and then you have the undergroundlings, which are kind of like Mediterranean dwarves, as how they are pretty much described, which I don't think is a particularly great name for them, but like, a lot of the story is the negotiations between all of these races, while a group of thirdlings, Tungdil's birth clan, with a reputation for hating other dwarves, break the peace they've held for years to get their titular revenge. All while Tungdil has a midlife crisis before he's just 100 years old, and that's like super young in dwarf years, thanks to the shit he went through in a relatively short time skip. Tungdil and Bewindil lead the A-plot here, everything I mentioned above, plus a lot of dwarven and elf politics you expect to see from the genre. Belindis sits this book out largely, but we get another love interest for Bewindil in her stead when Goda joins the primary cast. The granddaughter of a pretty major side character from Book 2, Out for Revenge. I really like her character and where she goes by the end of this book, but by Belindil, the romance she has with Bewindil is a little weird, largely because they have a mentor-mentee relationship, something pretty heavily frowned upon here in America because of that weird power dynamic. Rodario is the prime motivator of the B-plot here, searching for series regular Fergus, his longtime friend who went missing after the tragedies that happened at the end of Book 2. His cast is bulked up by his new girlfriend with a libido and a moral compass on par with his own, and it really shows Rodario's depth of character when he is, pretty much held up against a mirror. His plot hunting for Fergus leads him to a mysterious island where the hell beasts from the Doom games are created. Seriously, they are described as hideous amalgamations of half Alfar deformities and machine powered by magic to be living Hellraiser tanks. It's monstrous. I love it. Needless to say, a lot happens in this book, and it is largely really well paced throughout. I also understand the narrative purpose of assassinating Tungdil's character a little bit. It sets up a lot of cool threads down the line, but I think it could have been handled so much better. I found it a lot easier to keep up with the jumping between characters than it was in the last book as well. Everyone feels more distinguished from one another. As much as Heitz is still killing it when it comes to his characters in this book, continuing the trend of the previous two, he equally brings it when it comes to the plot and storytelling in this installment. Neil Dixon is back again as narrator, and he slips into all the roles better than before. I don't entirely know how to praise him for his work without repeating myself, so just know if you liked what you got in the last book again, that is improved here. Final thoughts on Book 3, I am really glad I am rereading this series. You can see a really clear progression in the author's style and work. Das Schicksal der Zwerg, The Fate of the Dwarves. Thus far on this readathon, I found a pretty direct line between the book and sequence and how much I enjoy them. I.e., Markus Heitz continues to improve as a writer as he continues to explore the universe he has created, centered around Girglegard. I love that this story switches the primary point of view character Plus, the time jump does a lot in this story's benefit, I find, especially to re-up the stakes of the situation. Because the world has really and genuinely gone to shit since we last left it. It has been something like 250 years since the last book ended, and in that time, the Alfar have a new little kingdom in Girglegard. A new yet old evil wizard has utterly decimated one of the 5 dwarven kingdoms. Another is in constant battle with the universe's Dragon 2.0, because dragons also exist in this universe, by the way. A Ordrian, the human realms are in utter disarray and also live under control of a typical dragon. Plus, all of the old hostilities between the evil dwarves and everyone else have started back up, because why else not? This book and the next are absolutely Boindil's books as opposed to Tungdil's, which works far more in the narrative's benefit, I feel. The bulk of the story following him and a new band of heroes led by a long-thought dead hero as they systematically wreck shop around the known world to set things right, before heading back to the Outer Lands for one of my favorite reading-listening experiences battle-wise. Oh, and yeah, 250-year time skip, so the love of my life, Rodario, has long since died. Except he fucked his way across Girglegard so hard, his bastard descendants are still kicking. All of them are named variations of Rodario, by the way, and it is fucking genius. I love it. And being a general hassle to the forces of evil out of respect for their namesake. Every single Rodario is perfect, but the sandbagging piece of shit we follow is by far the most interesting, literally flirting his way into royalty twice over, and the ultimate polyamorous V. So much happens over the course of this novel that at the beginning we are probably worse off than when the series started. You know, Tungdil, a bastard dwarf on an errand mission in a vaguely hostile world, that by the end of the narrative just about every significant problem is really neatly tied up with. A rarity for Heitz's writing. Neil Dixon is again back as narrator if you are going by the audiobook version I listened to, and is again way more consistent than ever across the multiple characters he has to voice while also narrating this adventure. I don't love every accent he chooses with each individual character, but also understand he is working on a limited pool as a performer, and I feel he made a choice to make 1 or 2 characters sound distinct over fitting for how they're described in the text, if that makes sense. Needless to say, I like Fate of the Dwarves a whole lot. It might very well be my favorite for the franchise, but I have one more book to reread, and since I started the deep dive, I realized that a 6th book has been released in this world, so let's see if this streak of improvement continues. The Triumph des Zwergs, the Triumph of the Dwarves. Okay, so I don't entirely love this book. The fate of the dwarves ended with a great tragedy that fitted the characters and the world. It almost felt like Heitz felt obligated to return to this world to tell one more definitive conclusion than the one that transpired in Fate. That is entirely conjecture on my part. On a technical level, Heitz also makes a lot of decisions that don't entirely make sense to me, sidelining important characters from the last book that are still important to this narrative in favor of resurrecting characters that don't want to be in the story with a hand wave of explanation. It took Heitz 10 years to get from Fate to Triumph as well, but in the narrative it has only been a matter of months since the last story ended. Things are going so well, in fact, that tens of thousands of elves are immigrating back to Girglegard. Right around the time the polycule from last story take on an orphan they find in the mountains that only speaks Elfish, which reasonably makes all the dwarves a little concerned. Especially since it also appears that the girl has some kind of unnatural influence over those in her presence. Oh, and for no real reason to the dwarves, an army appears on one of their gates and just sends an almost never-ending wave of every sort of being to just mindlessly charge the walls. It makes for a really unsettling image, which leads me to one of the things I like most about this story, and that being as sloppy as I found Heitz's narrative this time around, his words, or at least the translation from Hila Alabaster, flows a lot more smoothly in this book. Again, we get a major point of view shift for the dwarves, this time to Harrigan Deathbringer, a minor character throughout the entire series. It is a pretty solid shift, all things considered. Harrigan Deathbringer. Harrigan was essentially part of an execution squad in stories past, working undercover for the elves, and has been working his ass off to rebuild his reputation amongst the non-dwarves of the kingdom and queendoms of Girglegard. who again are pretty useless since everyone is under sway of this one teenager that speaks Elfish. This story has a lot of movement between kings and queens as well. This is probably the most Game of Thrones Heitz gets throughout the entire series so far, for better or worse, as it means there are way more moving parts and an already convoluted narrative in which plot threads just kind of get dropped in now typical Heitz fashion. Neil is back narrating and as good as ever. I am struggling to find anything new to say about his performance, other than it is just approved across the board. He continues to become a better narrator as time goes on. I had significantly less issues with confusing the characters he was distinguishing, and Dixon is so freaking clear when it comes to pronouncing minor differences in nouns like elf and Scintian and Lindarian. Yeah, the Dwarves never really got over its crazy fantasy name-itis. And this was supposed to be it when I started this readathon, until I discovered Heitz again revisited the world of the Dwarves several times over, but not a lot of those are translated yet, so I haven't had a chance to read that. But let's do a real quick ranking of these books, because that's what the YouTube likes to do. It's going to be probably pretty clear to those who have listened this far. Bottom of the list is going to be book number 5, The Triumph of the Dwarves. It just feels unnecessary. I really wish we stopped it before, but I get Heitz wanting to continue this story. I do get it. Then let's see. My 4th favorite is going to be probably the first book. Just The Dwarves from 2003. It's a really good, really straightforward narrative. It's a little rough. It's a very straightforward narrative, unfortunately. And that has its strengths and its weaknesses. So that's going to go on number 4 for my favorites in this series, followed by book number 2. What is book number 2? The War of the Dwarves. Yeah, I've always appreciated War of the Dwarves. I like where the third act goes. I love what it does with Rogario, especially. He essentially fucks one of the bad guys in a way that he wins. He seduces his way to victory. He is the perfect bard. And then after that I'm going to say Revenge of the Dwarves, the 3rd book in the series. It's frustrating. No, I'm going to switch those. Definitely going to switch those. Revenge of the Dwarves is number 3 in my favorites, and War of the Dwarves is number 2, because I don't love what Revenge of the Dwarves does to Tungdil's character. I like the story overall. I love what he brings to this story. I love the Ubaru and the Undergroundlings as a whole, but I don't love a lot of Heitz's character decisions here. So Revenge of the Dwarves is number 3. War of the Dwarves is number 2, which means, of course, Fate of the Dwarves is number 1. So that makes sense to me. If you've been following along, I really like the Fate of the Dwarves. I'm not going to spoil the twist that comes pretty early into the series in this book. So if you do get this far into the book series, because it is a big chunky book series with a lot of fantasy names, then I'll leave you that unspoiled. But I really like what they do in Fate of the Dwarves. So thank you so much for sticking with me this whole video while I talked about the Dwarf series. There is a lot more to say, and as soon as the new books are released in English and I can catch up, I assure you I will. But next time I'm tackling something totally different. A quick little pilot for a new series. Nature, hardly newer. First episode, The Murder Noodle of the Trees. Then right after that, we are jumping back into Through My Eyes with a deep dive into Superman just in time for the new James Gunn movie and what makes the Man of Steel still matter. Until then, please stand your ground and swing true, honor your word, like any good dwarf would.